The chamber was cold, as it always was when the High Council of the Galactic Conclave gathered to decide the fate of something small. 17 alien faces arranged in a crescent of pale light, their translated voices overlapping into a polished consensus that had ended 11 civilizations before this one. The vote was 17-2. The dissenters, an elderly Vorath diplomat named Kale Su and a junior conclave archivist who would later disappear from all official records, cited a single file. A stack of anomalous reports, 40 years deep, from every survey mission ever sent near the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star at the edge of mapped space. No one read the file. The termination order was signed at 300 station time, in a room that smelled of recycled air and old certainty, and a species called humanity was given a death sentence by people who had never once spoken to them. Admiral Voskareth received her commission the following morning. She was the Conclave's finest fleet commander, patient as stone, precise as mathematics, undefeated across 3 decades of pacification campaigns. She accepted the mission with the quiet confidence of someone who had done harder things. The briefing packet on humanity was 42 pages. She read it in 2 hours. Pre-industrial species that stumbled into fusion drives roughly 2 centuries ago. No unified government. Perpetually at war with itself. No formal alien contact. No standing interstellar military. Class 7 Deathworld biology, extreme environments, high-gravity adaptation, unusual pain tolerance, but nothing that translated into a tactical threat at scale. The fleet she commanded was 47 warships, the largest termination fleet ever assembled for a Class 7 target. Her second-in-command, Drain Vel, thought it was overkill. Voskareth agreed, but the High Council had been specific. Be certain, they said, leave nothing. She was 3 days into the transit when she found the footnote. It was buried at the bottom of page 31, flagged by an anonymous junior analyst 34 years earlier and never followed up on. 17 automated survey drones had been dispatched into Earth's nightside atmosphere between 200 and 220 years ago, sent to collect atmospheric data in preparation for early assessment. The footnote was 4 sentences long. It said that none of the 17 drones had returned. It said equipment failure had been assumed. It said the survey had been marked complete using orbital data instead. It said no further low-atmosphere missions had been recommended pending a review that was never conducted. Voskareth read the footnote 3 times. 17 drones, not 1, not 2. 17 consecutive equipment failures all in the same atmospheric zone over a period of 20 years, each one logged and explained away and forgotten. She pulled the original mission files. They were sparse telemetry up to a certain altitude, then silence, then nothing. No distress signals, no debris recovery, no system errors in the final data packet. Just a clean, sudden absence, as if each drone had reached a certain depth in Earth's sky and the universe had simply swallowed it. She told herself it was old equipment. She told herself atmospheric anomalies on death worlds were well documented. She filed the footnote in the back of her mind under irrelevant and went to sleep. She did not sleep well. Outside the viewport of her command ship, 46 warships moved in perfect formation through the dark between stars, titanium and plasma, and 3 centuries of conclave military doctrine, aimed at a single blue planet at the edge of the map. The math was overwhelming. The certainty was complete. And yet, somewhere in the quiet of that transit, in the space between one thought and the next, Voskareth found herself wondering something she had never wondered before in 30 years of warfare. She wondered why, in 40 years of knowing Earth was there, in 40 years of survey missions and anomaly reports, and one very quiet footnote about 17 missing drones, the Conclave had never once simply asked the humans what was down there in their dark. She closed the file. The fleet flew on. The Sol system's outer boundary looked like nothing. That was the first thing Voskareth noticed, the absolute ordinary nothing of it. Scattered rock and ice, background radiation, the distant arithmetic of a yellow star. Her sensor arrays found what they expected: an unremarkable system, a handful of planets, the faint thermal signatures of human infrastructure clustered near the Third World. Nothing that registered as a threat. Nothing that justified 47 warships. She sent the scout wing ahead. 4 frigates, fast, well-armed, crewed by the Conclave's best forward specialists. Standard picket protocol. Establish sensor positions, map defensive emplacements, report back within 90 minutes. They reported back in 6. The signal came in on emergency frequency, all 4 ships broadcasting simultaneously, and for a moment her communications officer thought it was a drill. That kind of overlapping cacophony didn't happen in real scenarios. It happened in training simulations when someone forgot to stagger the feeds. But it wasn't a drill. Voskareth crossed the bridge in 4 steps and listened. 2 of the frigates were screaming. Not their alarms, their crews. The sound was human, and that was the wrong word, she knew, but no other word fit. It was a sound like human voices, like the biological frequency of a species in absolute extremity, except it was coming from conclave throats and conclave bodies, and it was the same sound, the exact same modulation, from every crew member on both ships simultaneously, as if something had reached inside them and found the frequency of terror and played it like a chord. The other 2 frigates were silent, not destroyed, not broadcasting damage reports. Silent in the specific way that silence arrives when something has been turned off rather than broken. They were never found. Voskareth pulled the 2 screaming frigates back immediately and put them in medical quarantine. She sat with the recording of the transmission for 40 minutes before she made herself listen to it again all the way through. What she had taken for random screaming had a structure to it. Her acoustic analyst found it first, a repeating pattern buried under the biological noise. 3 words in conclave, standard cycling on a loop with machine precision. We see you, we see you, we see you. The frigates had been in the outer system for less than 90 minutes. No human ship had approached them. No human broadcast had been detected on any open frequency. The transmission had arrived on an encrypted conclave military channel that humanity was not supposed to know existed. Voskareth called her war council. Drainvel arrived last. He was the steadiest creature she had ever known. In 30 years, she had seen him walk into situations that made hardened soldiers faint and emerge composed, unreadable, categorically unbothered. He sat down at the council table and placed both of his classification hands flat on its surface, palms down, fingers spread. In Vorith culture, that gesture meant one thing. I am about to tell you something I cannot make sound rational, and I need you to hear it anyway. He said the transmission did not originate from the outer system. He let that sit for a moment. It originated from Earth's surface. Triangulation is certain. Someone on the surface of that planet found our scout wing's encrypted frequency, broke it, and responded before our frigates had completed a single sensor sweep. He paused again. That should take months. Minimum. For a species with our technology, months. I don't have an explanation. The council chamber was very quiet. Voskareth looked at the tactical display, at the long, clean distance between her fleet and that small blue world, at the 43 warships still at her back. She thought about footnotes, about 17 drones, about the particular silence of 2 frigates that simply stopped existing without leaving debris. She thought about the words on the loop, "We see you." She had entered this system believing she was the hunter. Sitting in that chamber, listening to the recycled air and the distant hum of 43 fusion drives, she became aware, with the slow, cold certainty of a fact arriving late, that something on that planet had known she was coming before she arrived, had watched her approach, had let her get close enough to matter, had wanted her to hear those 3 words first. She ordered the fleet to full stop. 72 hours. That was how long Voskareth held the fleet at full stop, burning every sensor array she had at maximum resolution, mapping everything between her ships and that distant blue planet with the obsessive precision of someone who had just realized she did not know where she was standing. What the sensors found over those 72 hours rewrote every assumption in the briefing packet. The asteroid belt came first. Her chief cartographer spent 6 hours on the data before she called Voskareth to the mapping suite and spread it across the display in silence. What the Conclave's long-range surveys had catalogued as a standard debris field wasn't. The density was wrong. The distribution was wrong. Centuries of selective mining had removed specific rocks from specific positions and left others with geometric precision, creating corridors that looked like natural gaps until you overlaid a tactical projection. And then they resolved into something else entirely. Interlocking fields of shadow, sensor-deadening angles, channels that would funnel an approaching fleet into kill zones while making those kill zones look like open space. It had been built over generations. It had been built to be invisible to exactly the kind of survey scan the Conclave had been running for 40 years. It had been built for them, for this, for a fleet arriving from the Conclave's standard approach vector, which humanity had somehow calculated decades before the termination order was signed. Then the gas giants. Jupiter alone had 11 installations hidden in its upper atmosphere, running cold and dark and electromagnetically silent, invisible to passive sensors, detectable only because Voskareth was looking for them now, because she was looking for things that were trying not to be found. The installations served no commercial purpose. Their positions only made sense in a military context, as relay nodes for a distributed command network that didn't need a central hub, that couldn't be decapitated by destroying any single point. Then Earth itself. When the orbital imaging finally resolved at full clarity, Voskareth stood in front of the display for a long time without speaking. The briefing packet had described a fractured world, scarred by centuries of war, divided by ideology and competition. The imaging confirmed the scars. It did not confirm the fracture. Because layered over 100 years of rebuilt infrastructure, hidden in the geography of old blast zones and reclaimed industrial zones, and the margins of every major human settlement, was something that had no civilian explanation whatsoever. Fortification, dispersal, the careful, comprehensive architecture of a species that had taken every wound its own history had given it and used each one to figure out where the next wound would come from. Drainville stood beside her and was quiet for a long time. Then he said what both of them were thinking. They've been preparing for us, specifically for us, not for an unknown threat, for the Conclave's fleet doctrine, our approach vectors, our weapon systems. He pulled up a comparison chart, standard Conclave orbital bombardment patterns laid over the distribution of Earth's surface installations. The match was near perfect. They built their defenses around our playbook. Someone gave it to them, or they figured it out themselves from the 40 years of survey missions we sent, or... He stopped. Or they're better at this than we thought, Voskareth said. She studied the display, the asteroid corridors, the cold, dark installations around Jupiter, the fortified, deliberate, patient surface of a world that had been quietly turning itself into a fortress for a century, while sending the galaxy's observers exactly the image of chaos and dysfunction it wanted them to see. There was a strategy here that she recognized. Not the tactics. The tactics were alien to her, specific to human psychology and human geography. But the shape of it, the patience of it, the willingness to spend generations building a thing you might never need and might never be alive to use. She recognized it because she had spent her own career doing exactly the same thing for the Conclave. She recognized it the way one chess player recognizes another across a board, in the specific quality of the problem they've been handed. She requested a communication channel to Earth's surface. The response came back in 40 seconds. Voskareth had expected to wait hours to navigate automated systems, bureaucratic layers, the friction of a species that hadn't been expecting to be called. The 40-second response told her everything the sensor data hadn't. They had been waiting by the communication array. The voice that came through was calm, unhurried. A middle-aged woman speaking Conclave standard with a slight, deliberate accent, the linguistic equivalent of a calling card, a signal that said I learned your language from recordings. I chose not to erase the imperfection, and I want you to know that I chose it. She identified herself as Secretary General Adiz Nwakoma of the United Earth Government. She did not ask why Voskareth was calling. She did not perform surprise. She said, "Admiral, we've been tracking your fleet since you entered the Kuiper Belt. We have a copy of the termination order, the full text, including the classified annexes." A brief pause, not awkward but deliberate, the pause of someone who knows exactly what they've just said and is giving it space to land. "We'd like to invite you to Earth's surface for a conversation before anything else happens. We've prepared something for you to see." Another pause. "Then come alone or bring whoever you need to trust what you're about to learn. Either way, come. We won't get another chance to do this the easy way." The transmission ended, 12 seconds total. Voskareth sat with it for 4 hours. Her war council argued in shifts, Drainvel against the visit on the grounds that it was an obvious trap. Her weapons officer in favor on the grounds that the fleet was tactically stalled anyway, and intelligence had value. 3 others cycling between positions as the hours ground by. The argument that settled it wasn't tactical. It was the one her cartographer raised quietly near the end of the 4th hour, looking at the orbital imaging on the secondary display. If they wanted to destroy the fleet, Admiral, they've had opportunities. They haven't taken them. She looked around the table. "I think they want to talk more than we want to listen. I think that asymmetry is worth something." Voskareth went. She took a single shuttle, a single aid and her sidearm. Not because she thought a sidearm would matter, but because she was the kind of person who wore her sidearm to funerals, not for use but for what it said about the wearer. She landed in a city that smelled of rain and machinery, and something organic she couldn't classify. Nwakoma met her on the landing platform personally, a compact woman in her 60s with the unhurried bearing of someone who had already survived every version of this meeting in her imagination. No military escort. No ceremony. She extended a hand, the human greeting gesture, and when Voskareth hesitated, Nwakoma said, "It means we come unarmed. It means we trust each other enough to close the distance." She kept her hand out until Voskareth took it. They shook hands on a rain-wet platform above a city of 10 million people, with 43 conclave warships hanging in orbit overhead, and Nwakoma walked her inside like she was showing a neighbor her house. What Nwakoma showed her was not a war room. It was not a trophy hall. It was not a display of military capability assembled to intimidate. It was, Voskareth would later write in her report, simply the truth of what humanity had done while the galaxy was looking the other way, laid out with the quiet matter-of-factness of people who had stopped needing anyone else's validation for it a long time ago. The deep bore facilities came first. They descended 3 kilometers below a mountain range whose tectonic position had been selected, Nwakoma explained, for its geological stability under sustained orbital bombardment. The facilities ran on geothermal power. They required no surface infrastructure to operate. They contained fabrication systems capable of rebuilding a spacefaring industrial base from raw ore in under a decade, fully automated, requiring no human operators after initial activation. Voskareth stood in a cavern the size of a small city and watched machines, the size of buildings, move in slow, purposeful arcs, and understood that this single installation could survive the complete destruction of everything on Earth's surface and spend the next 10 years quietly rebuilding it. There were 43 such facilities on Earth, 19 more on Luna. The number on Mars she wasn't shown, which told her the number was significant. Then the autonomous defense networks. Not weapons platforms, Nwakoma was careful about the distinction, and Voskareth was careful to notice that she was being careful. Not weapons built for attack. Systems built for persistence. Distributed across Earth's oceans and deep atmosphere in densities that made surgical removal impossible, running on distributed power sources with no central node, designed to operate independently for 4 centuries without human maintenance. They would adapt. They would learn from every engagement. They had no off switch accessible from orbit. Destroying the humans who built them would not turn them off. Destroying Earth's surface would not turn them off. They would simply continue, processing new data, updating their models, doing the thing they were made to do with the patient indifference of a tide. But none of that was what broke something open in Voskareth's chest. What broke it open was the archive ships. 17 of them already beyond the outer system, already past the reach of the fleet. Each one carrying a complete backup of human civilization, not a summary, not a cultural highlight reel, but everything. Every piece of recorded music, every scientific paper, every photograph, every genetic template for every species humanity had cataloged, every work of literature in every language, every engineering schematic, every medical database, every personal journal voluntarily submitted by citizens over 2 generations who had understood what they were contributing to. The genome of every human being alive, the memory of everyone who had ever lived and been recorded. Humanity had not prepared to survive the fleet. Humanity had prepared to be survived by their own civilization, to ensure that even if every human being died in the next 48 hours, something that was genuinely, completely, recognizably human would persist in the galaxy until the end of time. Voskareth stood in a corridor of cold light and said, "How long have you been building all of this?" Enwakoma considered the question with genuine care, as if it deserved a precise answer. The deep facility started about 90 years ago, the network's about 70. The archive project, 60 years of active collection, but the decision to do it was made 120 years ago after the second drone wave stopped reporting in. She paused. "We didn't know who you were. We knew someone was watching. We decided to behave accordingly." Voskareth looked at her. "You built all of this without knowing if anyone was coming." Enwakoma met her eyes steadily. "Admiral," she said, "every human who ever lived built for a future they weren't sure they'd see. We're not special. We're just consistent." Voskareth returned to the fleet. She called the full War Council to the command deck and locked the room. She stood at the tactical display for a moment, looking at the assembled faces of the finest military minds the Conclave had produced: admirals, tacticians, weapons specialists, strategic analysts with centuries of combined experience, and she thought, "They don't know yet. They're still looking at this the way we came in looking at it." She had brought no visual records of what she'd seen on the surface. She had only her words. She chose them carefully. She told them everything: the deep facilities, the networks, the archive ships. She watched their expressions change in sequence: skepticism, then attention, then the specific, still quality that experienced military minds adopt when they are recalculating. When she finished, Drainville said nothing for nearly 2 minutes. Then he pulled up the tactical display and began running projections quietly, methodically, with the focused calm of a surgeon. The rest of the council watched him work. He ran the standard Conclave assault package first: overwhelming orbital bombardment, surface denial, systematic elimination of resistance. He got a projected fleet survival rate of 61%, with an 89% probability of mission completion. Those were acceptable numbers by Conclave doctrine. Then he added the variables Voskareth had brought back. He modeled the asteroid belt firing corridors. He modeled the Jupiter relay network coming online during fleet dispersion. He modeled the autonomous defense systems persisting through and after bombardment, adapting, drawing the fleet into sustained low-orbit engagement with systems that didn't fatigue, didn't lose morale, didn't run out of organizational will. He modeled the tactical cost of not being able to finish it, of a fleet that spent itself destroying everything visible, and then found the thing it had destroyed rebuilding quietly underground, while its deep space communications were jammed by relay nodes it hadn't managed to eliminate. He put the revised fleet survival number on the board. It was not 0. He had been right that it was worse than 0. It was 22%, and that 22% would return home depleted, degraded with no strategic gain, having failed to complete a termination protocol for the first time in Conclave history, against a species the High Council had classified as pre-military. He said, "This is before the second-order consequences." He pulled up a star chart. The Conclave's frontier security in this corridor depends on our fleet presence. If we spend this fleet here and don't complete the mission, the frontier is exposed for the 18 months it takes to reconstitute our strength. There are 3 species monitoring that corridor who will notice. He tapped the chart. The humans knew that. They positioned their defense timeline around it. They didn't need to defeat us. They needed to make defeating them cost more than it's worth. The weapons officer said what everyone was thinking. That's not how a pre-military civilization thinks. No, Drainvel agreed. He looked at Voskareth. It's how we think. Someone on that planet spent their career studying Conclave strategic doctrine, identified our constraints, and built a deterrence architecture specifically calibrated to our limitations. A pause. They didn't build this to win a war. They built it to make the war unwinnable before it started. Silence. Voskareth looked around the table at her fleet's finest minds, and she saw it happen in each of them, one by one, the same reorientation she had undergone on a rain-wet landing platform below a city of millions. The moment when this stopped being a termination mission and became something else, something that didn't have a word in the Conclave's military lexicon. She opened a communication channel to Earth's surface. Enwakoma had expected the second call. Voskareth could tell by the speed of the response. The formal negotiation that followed was unlike any diplomatic exchange in Conclave archives, for a reason that became clear within the first 20 minutes. Enwakoma was not negotiating. She was presenting terms. Calmly, without hostility, with the precise clarity of someone who has rehearsed a conversation for a decade because they believed it would someday happen. She laid out exactly what humanity wanted from the Conclave, and exactly what she was prepared to offer in return. The offer was not a ceasefire. The offer was intelligence. Enwakoma transferred a data package to the fleet's secure systems. When Voskareth's science officer opened it, she went quiet immediately, the specific quiet of someone processing something that requires all available cognitive resources. She stayed quiet for 11 minutes. Drainvel watched her and said nothing. No one spoke. They waited for her to come back. When she did, she said, "How old is this data?" Enwakoma's voice came through the open channel. "Our earliest confirmed observations are 60 years old. We've been collecting continuously since." The data was a catalog, methodical, comprehensive, terrifying in its implications. For 60 years, humanity had been pointing sensors into the unmapped regions of space that lay beyond the Conclave's charted frontier, the regions that Conclave surveys had visited briefly and categorized as empty, or as low-density background phenomenon, or as electromagnetic noise too diffuse to warrant investigation. Humanity had not categorized it as noise. Humanity had been watching it, mapping it, modeling it with the patient accumulation of data that a species obsessed with its own survival applies to a threat it has identified but cannot yet confront. What they had found was not background noise. It was movement. Vast, slow, deliberate movement structures on a scale that made the Conclave's largest installations look like grains of sand, advancing along vectors that had been consistent for at least 3 centuries. Not ships, not a fleet. Something that had no analog in Conclave xenological records. Something that had been there, had always been there, patient and enormous and aware, while the Conclave mapped the comfortable center of the galaxy and called it everything. The science officer pulled up the trajectory projections. She put them on the main display without comment. The Conclave's mapped space sat in the center of the display. The movement vectors converged on it from 6 directions simultaneously. Timeline, Voskareth asked. Best estimate 90 to 120 years before the leading edge reaches the frontier. The science officer's voice was very controlled. Possibly less. There's evidence the pace has increased in the last decade. Voskareth looked at the display for a long time. Then she said, "Why are you giving us this?" Enwakoma's answer came back without hesitation. "Because it's everyone's problem. Because we've known for 30 years that we couldn't face it alone, and we've spent 30 years building everything we'd need to face it with someone, and then we spent time waiting for someone to arrive who we could show it to." A slight pause. You arrived. You arrived planning to kill us, which was unfortunate, but you arrived. We've been standing here in the dark watching this thing grow for 60 years, Admiral, and we are very tired of standing alone. Voskareth thought of the outward-facing defense installations she had seen on the surface, the ones Enwakoma had never explained, the ones that pointed not toward the Conclave's approach vector, but into the deep, unmapped dark, into exactly the directions the data package was now identifying as threat vectors. Humanity had not just been preparing for the fleet, they had been preparing for what came after the fleet. Your terms, Voskareth said. Recognition, sovereignty, full partnership status in the Conclave, not as a protected client species but as a founding partner, with a permanent seat on the High Chamber. A pause that was almost, but not quite, warm, and an agreement to share everything we know about what's coming, combined with everything you know about how to build the kind of coalition that might survive it. Drainvel leaned toward Voskareth and said, very quietly, she's been waiting to make this offer for 30 years. This isn't improvised. She came to this conversation having already won it. Voskareth nodded slowly. She keyed the channel. We'll need to bring this to the High Council. Enwakoma said, I know, tell them to read the data package before they vote, all of it, the last 3 files especially. Another pause. Tell them what's coming doesn't know about votes. It doesn't know about councils. It doesn't care what we decide. It's already on its way. Her voice was steady and unremarkable and absolute. But we have time to be ready. That's all we've ever needed. A little time and the willingness to use it. The channel stayed open. Outside, 43 warships drifted in the cold light of a yellow star, and somewhere in the unmapped dark, something enormous and patient moved along a vector it had been holding for centuries. The fleet left Sol system 14 days later. No shots fired, no debris, no footnote in a casualty report. 43 warships forming up in quiet, disciplined order, turning their drives toward the Conclave's core systems, carrying in their data banks a package of intelligence that would, within 6 months, reclassify humanity's threat assessment from termination target to essential partner, and trigger the largest strategic realignment in Conclave history. Voskareth wrote her final mission report in her command chair on the long transit home. She wrote it carefully, methodically, the way she did everything. But when she reached the final paragraph, she stopped for a long time and stared at the viewport and the stars moving past it, and she thought about a woman on a rain-wet platform extending her hand across the distance between 2 species and saying it means we come unarmed. She wrote, we were sent to erase a primitive species from a death world at the edge of mapped space. The classification was wrong on every meaningful level. What we found was a civilization that has spent a century standing guard in the dark for a galaxy that didn't know it needed guarding, that built its defenses not out of aggression, but out of the particular human conviction that preparation is an act of love, that doing the hard thing now in order to protect something later is worth any cost. They were afraid. They told us so freely, without shame. Secretary General Enwakoma told me that humans have never found a way to stop being afraid of the dark. She told me they decided a long time ago that this didn't matter. I will not be the admiral who destroyed that. I will not leave that in my record, or in theirs, or in whatever record outlasts us both. The High Council read the data package, all of it, the last 3 files especially. The vote on humanity's partnership status was 17-0. The 2 dissenters who had opposed the original termination order were quietly reinstated to full standing. The archivist who had flagged the 40-year file of anomalous reports, the one who had disappeared from official records, was found retired on a small colony world, brought before the chamber, and formally thanked for the first time in his 30-year career. He was 91 years old. He cried briefly and said he was glad someone had finally read the footnote. On Earth, Enwakoma watched the fleet's drive signatures fade to nothing on the long-range display. Her aide stood beside her, a young man named Yusuf who had been with her office for 2 years and still hadn't fully learned how to hide what he was feeling. She could see the relief in him, the loosening of something he'd been carrying. He asked her if she felt it too. She thought about it honestly, because she was that kind of person. She said, "No, not relief. Relief means the danger past." She nodded toward the far side of the display, the dark region beyond the charted frontier, where the data they'd been collecting for 60 years showed something vast and old and indifferent moving on its slow trajectory. "The danger hasn't passed. It won't pass in my lifetime, possibly not in yours." She turned from the display and walked back toward her desk, back toward the work that was already waiting. "What I feel is that we bought some time. And time is what we're good at." She sat down, she opened the next file, she got back to work. In deep space, 17 archive ships sailed silently into the unmapped dark, carrying the full memory of 8 billion human lives into the infinite, just in case. Along the conclave frontier, new treaty negotiations were already being drafted. In the cold belt between Mars and Jupiter, mechanisms that had spent decades running cold and quiet in perfect patience shifted almost imperceptibly, recalibrating their sensors toward new vectors, toward the slow, vast movement of a thing that was still a century away but was, undeniably, coming. And on 100 worlds across the conclave, in briefing rooms and council chambers and military academies, and the private offices of people who made decisions that determined the fate of civilizations, people who had read the data package were having the same conversation. Who are these humans? How did they see this when we didn't? How long were they standing there in the dark alone, watching this thing come, and saying nothing because no one had asked? The answer, had they known to ask it, was simple. They had been standing there since they first looked up at the sky and understood that the sky was bigger than they were, which was before they had cities, before they had writing, before they had words for the feeling at all. They had been standing there since the very first human being sat at the edge of the very first fire, staring into the dark beyond its light, and decided that the dark was something to understand rather than simply to fear. They had been standing there the whole time. They had just been waiting for the rest of the galaxy to arrive. And